Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are now at the fourth and final in this four-part series looking at tenant stabilization policies. And really, this whole conversation has been an attempt to dig past a conversation about sort of good, bad, yes, no, and really talk about the details that makes a policy valuable and important in our community. I'm Stephanie Brown. I'm the executive director of the Urban Land Institute here, and I want to thank our partners at the Federal Reserve who have been so crucial in organizing this series and pulling it together. Today, we really wanted to take a look to opportunity to broaden the conversation beyond just the rent stabilization policies and to understand the intersections of those policies and other tenant protection, stabilization, and affordability strategies and tools that are being used both here in our region and across the country. We have three excellent panelists joining us today. Dr. Tina Stacy, who's a principal research associate at the Urban Institute. She specializes in urban economics, equity, and inclusion. She's doing some deep work on both rent stabilization policies and inclusionary zoning, has also looked at local zoning reforms and how they can increase the supply of affordable housing, ADUs, new market tax credits, and even looking at cash transfers and how to deal with economic and income gaps that we face. We're also joined by Michael Spotts, who is a fellow at the Urban Land Institute's Terwilliger Center. He's also the founder and president of Neighborhood Fundamentals. He's been doing research and technical assistance for on-the-ground practitioners, public and private sector around the country, including here in Minnesota. And finally, we are joined by Shane Phillips, who manages the Randall Lewis Housing Initiative for UCLA's Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and is the author of the recent book, The Affordable City, Strategies for Putting Housing Within Reach and Keeping It There. And I will, with that, turn it over to Shane first to start us off and frame up this discussion. Shane?
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen here really quickly. I will say my presentation does kind of focus on rent control a little bit, but it does get at some of what we're talking about more broadly. And I'm very much looking forward to the questions and the conversation with the panelists to kind of broaden this out. But I put this presentation together kind of to just touch on a lot of different things and hopefully spark some conversation. It's very shallow in some respects, but hopefully I have the depth to get into the details if questions come up to address it. But just very quickly, the purpose of rent control for me, I think, a point I want to make up front, and I'm sure you've heard this many times, is that rising prices, unaffordable housing is not really a consequence of not having rent control or really any kind of tenant protections. It is first and foremost a result of high demand and limited supply, some combination of those two things or some mismatch between them anyway. This left chart is really just showing that when vacancies are low, rent growth is high, and when vacancies are high, rent growth is low. This is a very consistent finding across the country and in specific markets. And of course, we have just not been building much housing, so the supply has not been there. This chart on the right is just showing the change in per capita housing production over the past few decades in two different periods, and every single metro area is permitting less during this latter period than it was in the previous decade. But at the same time, I think rent control and other tenant protections are, they are proposed as a palliative, as a way to kind of relieve some of these problems, but they are framed sometimes as the cause of these problems. And you'll see places like Los Angeles, like San Francisco, that have rent control and very high prices, and rent control will be blamed for those. But what we actually see in many cases, not all, but many, is that rent control very often followed down zoning and other policies that limited the supply of housing, caused prices to shoot up, and rent control came in and was proposed as a way to at least address the symptoms, if not the cause. So an analogy I've taken to using recently is rent control is a sort of painkiller. If you have a serious disease like cancer, you obviously have to treat it directly, whether that's with chemotherapy, radiation, what have you. Painkillers accompany that treatment, so it's easier to endure. But we don't withhold painkillers from people just because they don't treat the underlying disease. We recognize that that's not their purpose. And we also recognize, or doctors recognize anyway, or should, that painkillers have their own risks and harms. But because they are aware of that, they're able to design a safer treatment regimen. And ultimately, painkillers are most dangerous when doctors misunderstand or are misinformed about their risks and potential harms. As planners, we also have to treat the underlying cause of rising prices, which is scarcity, but we need to address the symptoms as well. We can't just let them fester. And rent control and other tenant protections can be one way to do that. Rent control doesn't make housing more affordable. I think that's important to note, but that's not really its goal. It slows the pace of change in rents for individual households, at least as long as they stay in the same unit. And it offers a lot of predictability and security, which I think is overlooked, but it does have drawbacks and limitations of its own. And as with the doctor example, I think we get into trouble when we ignore or are unaware of those drawbacks and limitations, or we mistake the painkiller, the rent control, for addressing the root cause. And in this case, we design rent control in ways that undermine long-term affordability. So as far as impacts, this is a very, there's a lot missing from this summary of impacts, but just some that I want to emphasize here that rent control has been associated with. It certainly helps many households maintain below market rents, again, as long as they don't move, which is, a benefit and a drawback there. It does reduce the rental housing supply generally by either discouraging development of new rental housing or encouraging the conversion of existing rental units into owner occupancy or commercial uses, or just demolition of them, or both of those things can happen. And that, of course, does result in rising prices. But the extent to which it reduces the rental housing supply is very contingent on how the policy is designed. And in particular, first generation rent control has much more severe effects than second generation rent control, which is what we mostly see these days, with St. Paul actually being an exception. And tenants in their rent stabilized housing do stay in their homes longer. I've looked this up, done research on this in Los Angeles, and seen that in the city of Los Angeles, where we have rent stabilization, residents, the average tenure for rent stabilized tenants is much longer than it is just to the south in Long Beach, where they don't have rent stabilization. So I want to just kind of summarize how I see two main goals of rent control or rent stabilization. One that I think is usually emphasized, maybe because it's easier to measure, is it's intended to keep prices affordable. And I think that, rent control often falls short on this. It helps some people, but if you, move at all, you lose a lot of benefit from it. And it does have this trade-off of there is maybe slower household level price appreciation or price rent increases, but you may be getting in exchange faster city or metro or regional area price appreciation for kind of everyone else, including the rent stabilized tenants who might be moving at some point in the future. The other side of this, which I think is more overlooked and really important, and as someone who now owns a home, but rented for a very long time, I think homeowners in particular can overlook just how valuable it is to know what your life is going to look like, where you're going to live in a year or 3 years from now, and have some sense that, your rent is not going to be 50% higher, say. You can only go up 4% a year. And so, that's the most you're going to be paying. That predictability and security is not there's no great way to assign a financial value to that, but it does have value. People buy insurance for a reason, and this is sort of a form of insurance for people. Something I like to bring up Tokyo as a case study here, and I'm saying this all as someone who supports rent stabilization, but a very particular about the actual way it's designed and the different program components. Tokyo is a great case where they have very strong tenant protections, including stabilized rents. And despite that, they build 5 times more housing per capita than California, and about double or a little more than that of what Minnesota and Minneapolis build per capita. Rent control is not the thing that is stopping, it is not stopping Tokyo from building housing and keeping prices stable, mostly via market production. Rent control also isn't really helping much because the market production is doing so much, but it does still provide that sort of backstop and that peace of mind. So this is really what I want to emphasize here, is that if you want to build more housing, you will achieve that by enacting policies that make it easier to build housing. Prohibiting rent control is not the way that you get more housing to be built. It is usually a distraction. And I do want to say, St. Paul's proposed or approved rent control law, I think, will have very severe negative impacts, but that is very much an outlier. And in the vast majority of circumstances, the thing that is preventing cities from building more housing has nothing to do with tenant protections. It's all zoning, approval processes, these kinds of things. So my last section here, I want to say, I'm a supporter of rent stabilization. I think it can work. I've seen it work in many places, but again, how we design it really does matter. And I like to point as a more, as an extreme case here, Mumbai, which has had or had first generation rent control for decades, meaning they restricted rent increases between vacancies. So that's vacancy control. And they sharply restricted annual rent increases even when they were allowed. And new buildings were not exempt from these rules. And what I'm drawing your attention to in this red box here is the change in both owner-occupied and renter-occupied housing over a 50-year period. And what we see is that owner-occupied housing in Mumbai increased by 2,500% from 1961 to 2011, and rental housing stock increased by 4.59%. So basically nothing was built for 50 years, and it was because of the rent control law. So this is like the extreme version of how badly how much harm you can do with a rent control law, but we're really nowhere near that in most cases here in the US. So last couple slides here, hopefully, there we go. This is from the University of Minnesota, Ed Getz, Anthony Damiano, and co-authors. They did a Minneapolis rent stabilization study. I don't know if they were on a previous panel or anything, but they summarize the kind of main components of rent stabilization programs. I think this is really great. And the three that I think are most important are the choice of cap, how much rents can be increased each year, which buildings are exempt and which are not, and whether you have vacancy decontrol or not. And really last slide here, my recommendations for this based on my understanding of the research and just observing it in different cities here in California is that you want to cap rent increases around the inflation rate. A little below, a little above is probably fine. But you don't want to do just a hard cap regardless of the inflation rate, or just say we're going to do 1% every year, that kind of thing. I think exempting new buildings from rent stabilization is maybe the most important thing a city can do, even more so than vacancy decontrol. It's just really important for a developer to be able to open their building and not worry about, well, I opened in the middle of COVID and now my rents are going to be locked in at this price forever, and so I'm bankrupt from day one. There needs to be some period during which they can have some flexibility to make a profit. And then later down the road, it's not such a big deal. Expecting 3% increases per year is kind of fine. And then vacancy decontrol is, I'm assuming this has been explained, but this just means when a tenant moves out, that the landlord can set the rents at the market rate. And this is a way for them to sort of catch up, especially if they have a long-term tenant who is far below market, that kind of thing. And finally, since we're going to be talking about other kinds of tenant protections here, just cause eviction protections always have to come with rent stabilization. If you have rent stabilization without just cause eviction protections, which just say you can't evict a tenant for no reason, basically, they have to have done something wrong, or you need to be doing something like tearing down the building and redeveloping it. This is essential. Otherwise, evictions just become the loophole through which people can avoid the restrictions of rent control. So that is it for me. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the next panelists in the conversation.
Thank you, Shane. I'll turn it over to Michael Spots, who has just completed a really comprehensive piece of research, Stable Residents, Stable Properties, and we'll share more about that.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks, Shane, for that overview. My role in this sector is as an applied housing policy researcher, and I serve as a bridge between some of the empirical research and evidence that's developed by Shane, Tina, who you're about to hear from, and other great researchers from across the country on one side, and practitioners doing housing and community development work on the other. In my remarks, I'm going to zoom out a bit and look at policy frameworks and ideas beyond rent control and stabilization that might be germane to the Twin Cities. So in the context of the rental affordability crisis in the years leading up to 2020 and exacerbated by the pandemic and economic disruption, the Terwilliger Center decided to look at drivers of housing instability among renters and in rental properties. So that's our stable residents, stable properties research that Stephanie just mentioned. And through that process, we engage with stakeholders and practitioners from a range of perspectives through interviews and surveys, which we supplemented with a literature review and landscape analysis of policy and practice. Our main objective was to create a policy framework for improving resident stability, which we define as the ability of renter households, regardless of means, to live in safe, decent, and attainable homes without undue threat of involuntary displacement. This proposition requires the ability of property owners to be able to operate and steward properties in a manner that enables the ongoing safety, quality, and financial viability of those properties. And this definition is based on the interrelated nature of the challenge. Renter households cannot be stable if there are not homes to live in, and property stewardship is made more difficult if residents do not have stability in their lives. As a first step, I think it's important to discuss policy goals. Shane discussed the conflation of objectives in the specific context of rent control, illustrating that there's some overlap in the Venn diagram between predictability and affordability, but in the end, they're ultimately separate policy objectives. And the lack of clarity on objectives is a challenge that extends beyond this specific issue. So when we talk about specific policies, especially big controversial policies such as rent control or eviction moratoria, we need to spend more time highlighting the problem or problems we're trying to solve for, or the goal we're trying to achieve, and then find the best policy solutions. And I emphasize the plural there because it's never just one solution that can best address those problems. And there are a lot of factors that contribute to stability for residents, and therefore a lot of interventions that you might consider. In our outreach, particularly through the survey that I mentioned earlier, there was no consensus on what objectives should be prioritized and a relatively even distribution of preferences overall, which complicates the first principle issue. So even when we daylight the conversation on goals and what we're trying to achieve, we may not agree on what is most important. But when we looked at the whole picture, including not just these survey results, but the literature and insights from our more in-depth interviews with both tenant advocates and the property sector, a couple key takeaways emerged. And the first is that we need to focus on the core elements of stability. In the short term, finding ways for vulnerable tenants to afford rent, and longer term, making sure there are enough safe, decent homes that there's a degree of choice, which can rebalance a power dynamic driven by scarcity that often disadvantages tenants, giving them the proverbial ability to vote with their feet, so to speak. Second, we need to have adequate government capacity and focus on simplicity and clarity. We often hear of the challenges of bureaucracy and red tape from the owner and management sector, and that is a challenge. But when programs are not effectively administered, it also harms tenants who often struggle to navigate public services and support. So right sizing when you're selecting policy is critically important. And then finally, there's an opportunity to develop well-designed combinations of carrots and sticks that can improve housing quality and tenant living conditions. So every community has different needs. So to guide communities in evaluating policy options, we developed a framework for advancing resident stability. The first two elements, measure and evaluate and engage and listen, are really about identifying those specific needs and what they are, and identifying the community values and objectives that you might consider addressing through policy, financing, and development interventions. And the third category is where we get into specific policy tools. And whatever your local situation might be, we argue that there is a need to think holistically to address the full spectrum of barriers to resident stability. Those actions can fall into three categories: triage, strengthen, and reform. Triage triage is, with commonality with Shane's medical analogy to palliatives and cures. This expresses the need for immediate assistance for the most urgent pressing needs. So that can include relocation assistance in a redevelopment context or emergency rental assistance for households in crisis. Strengthening based reforms are long-term supports for economic mobility, housing production, and operation. These can include investments in preserving and developing income-restricted affordable housing, property tax incentives that encourage both market rate and mission-driven owners to reduce rents, and vouchers and long-term rental assistance, and the provision of social service in conjunction with housing supports. And finally, we get to the fundamental reforms that address the root causes and market failures. Zoning reform that expand the supply and diversity of housing, and changes to the legal process that provide a more even playing field for tenants in disputes with the owners or managers. These are just illustrative examples. It's not a comprehensive list. But it is important that policy efforts to advance resident stability include interventions in each category. Emergency responses without structural reform are costly and do a little to durably address underlying needs. And on the other hand, building consensus for structural reforms, such as considerable increases in development, is more difficult if there's no safety net for vulnerable households or current residents do not see an ongoing place for themselves in the community. So I'll close by sharing a resource that's included toward the end of our report. I don't expect anyone to be able to read this in full, but that details 24 specific policy examples with basic details on the objective they seek to achieve and real-world examples of applicability in practice. The chart also includes some foundational policies, those that may not have as direct or as significant of an impact in terms of scale, but create a basis on which other interventions can be layered or may be made more effective. For example, rental licensing requirements can provide critical data for measurement and evaluation, serve as a nexus point for tenant-landlord law education efforts, and provide a platform for both carrot and stick-based interventions to support housing quality. Anti-source of income discrimination laws and other strong anti-discrimination protections give potentially vulnerable tenants more housing choice. And that's particularly important to prevent tenant selection distortions in the context of rent stabilization with vacancy decontrol. And then tenant protections or protections for tenant organizing or support for tenant organizing efforts, particularly when paired with right to counsel and educational efforts to make sure that everyone is operating under accurate legal information, can help address the power imbalance that many individual tenants may face. So thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to Tina's presentation and the balance of the session. Thank you.
I'll turn it straight over to Tina. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. And I'm so appreciative always to get to work with Mike so he can translate what we are always, what the more academic researchers are saying. Mike, I love that your ability to do that is wonderful. And so great to hear from Shane as well. I'm also going to step back a bit and talk more about some other policies like Mike's mentioned as well. And really kind of hit some of the major policies and programs that cities often use to create or preserve affordable housing, rental housing that is affordable. So not necessarily affordable housing, which people often associate with subsidized housing, but housing more broadly that is affordable. So I'm going to just jump right in, skip the background, and kind of go quickly through this so we can get to the discussion portion. But one of the main policies that cities throughout the country are continuing and more frequently adopting now are inclusionary zoning policies, which I know are in effect in your region as well. So IZ requires or offers incentives to developers to set aside a share of units and new developments to be rented or sold at below market rates. Some IZ laws also allow developers to pay a fee in lieu of developing affordable housing or to build the units in a separate location from the main development. And I'm going to talk about why those are important and how these all kind of, how these different policies and investment opportunities kind of address different segments of the market and different short-term versus long-term outcomes, and how they really need to be paired together with things like rent control if you're going to do that to address both short-term and long-term and people with different levels of income. So I'm just going to skip again right to the findings that we've been doing research on inclusionary zoning and rent control, both qualitatively and quantitatively. And from our qualitative work, which is completed and our quant work is ongoing, we've pretty much heard from many, many different stakeholders that IZ is most likely a tool best suited to providing units affordable to moderate income households. It's really hard to create an IZ regulation that's going to create units that are affordable to someone at 30% of AMI or less. And I think this is important because this means that, in order to address the needs of all people within a region, we need to think about how we compare these different policies together to help hit those needs. So having an in lieu option that allows for direct development of affordable units through affordable housing developers is really one way of achieving both objectives of getting some of that more deeply affordable housing in addition to the IZ units. I will say though that, and I'll mention this in a moment, but setting those options for in lieu versus on-site or off-site requirements of development at the right level is really key because you want to get a good mix of both. A lot of cities have put in requirements for on-site or off-site development that are so much more costly or at least more unknown in terms of cost than the in lieu fee. So developers often or almost always choose the in lieu fees in some cities. In other cities, it's the opposite, right? And so if you want to get that mix of both on-site IZ affordable units, which are going to be more affordable for those moderate income people, as well as being able to more directly develop some units that are more deeply affordable, you're going to need to set those options you're going to need to find those levels that really balance that out. And so that developers will choose both. And so, like I said, requirements such as the level of affordability that units must have, the share of units that must be set aside as affordable, and the in lieu fee need to be set at a level that one, leads to the production of affordable units, but also does not distort the market so much that overall development declines. And then so that you can get this mix of both directly developed affordable, more deeply affordable units, and then the IZ units. And then, again, just while you're creating these laws, while you want to have these options and you want to set them at the right level, keeping them as simple as possible is something that we heard that was absolutely necessary. And then standardized across entire cities or regions is really important as well. A lot of cities kind of have one-off, maybe optional IZ types of programs, but we heard from developers, from landlords, from renters that it's really important to have regulations that are standardized across all development, or at least are clear. But beyond that, since I mentioned, that IZ really, it's hard to make it in a way that it's going to get you those deeply affordable units. I really think they must be paired with land use reforms more broadly. Oh, sorry. Well, I'm going to get into the direct development, but IZ and rent control, all these things like our previous speakers have mentioned, they really need to be paired with land use reforms more broadly that allow for increased density or make development easier. This can include things like increasing height allowances, reducing setback requirements, removing parking minimums, allowing for accessory dwelling units, banning single family zoning. And one that's often not talked about, but is so important, is simplifying the development process. We had this great quote from a developer and landlord, a small landlord in California, who told us that 40 years ago, when he first started being a contractor, he could walk into the county building with a plan that was basically 3 pages and walk out with a permit, and it would cost about $200. Now it takes you probably 4 to 6 months to get a permit and costs you $30,000. That's a huge impediment to development, right? Particularly for small landlords and small developers. So really digging into not just these kind of like bigger policies and programs, but really the process. How is the process for developing in your city or region? And then just a little bit of evidence on whether upzonings and other land use reforms, how they work, right? So, the research, many housing economists have posited that the lack of supply stems from this overly restrictive land use regulations. And so they theorize that reducing them or loosening them might allow housing production to increase and therefore decrease prices. But, it's not certain that this effect is going to be equal in the opposite direction, right? Others have argued that loosening land use and actually have shown that loosening land use restrictions may not reduce housing costs, at least in the short run, because in rezoned neighborhoods, builders might convert lower cost units into higher cost ones, and the amenity effects that come from those higher cost units may in turn further increase surrounding housing values. There has been research that has shown this, but this may be just a short-term effect. Maybe in the long run, the supply and demand effect will really help rental units in the long run. So again, while these types of upzonings may, in the long run, through filtering, affect the affordability of rental units, in the short run, I think, again, you need to pair these with policies that will address those short run effects, which could even be negative, not just null. And so, I'm going to skip mostly through the rent control. I think you've all, through this and the previous webinars, really gotten a deep taste on rent control. I will just mention, though, that I do have some slightly differing opinions or takeaways than our first speaker on some of the characteristics. So on some of the components of this, I think he covered very well that there, generally I would say that the research shows that rent control does benefit tenants who live in rent controlled units, but it could potentially harm tenants who do not live in rent controlled units. Happy to get into that more in the discussion. And I will note that it was really interesting for me getting to talk to landlords, developers, community organizers, and people who represent communities with low incomes and people of color, and to hear them say that that they highly value rent control, even though it's not means tested, but that they feel like it has a lot of these benefits that Shane mentioned that aren't spoken of. And also just helping with power imbalances. I'll just mention, it's not in my slides, but one thing I would love to hear Shane talk about more, like discuss in the discussion, is the issue of vacancy decontrol, because vacancy decontrol, where rents can be popped up, really misaligns incentives for landlords to officially or unofficially. Really unofficial is what we heard a lot and saw a lot, and I actually have personal experience with that, which is funny. That when a landlord knows that if I'm going to be able to pop up the rent when someone leaves, I'm going to try and get them to leave, right? Whether that's by not fixing stuff quickly, just generally being non-responsive, selecting in tenants. We actually heard that same landlord say, I try to get students in because I know they're going to leave quickly. That disincentivizes landlords from even taking in families and things like that. So we really have to think about the disincentives. And while just cause eviction protections help a bit, they're necessary but not sufficient. They really, we've seen through this housing crisis through COVID and stuff. One, there's often not enough lawyers. People don't know their rights. There's so many ways that landlords can get evictions through, or informal evictions, like I'm saying, through informally trying to get people out. So I would argue that vacancy decontrol, I would vote for it, vacancy control. But again, if you do decide to enact rent control, I know you all, the various cities in the region have different types of rent control regulations, but it needs to be designed very carefully to make sure that it preserves affordability for stabilized renters while not harming the supply of housing overall. Skip through some of this since I know you've covered that a lot. And I just want to mention that all of these really need to be paired with direct investments in affordable housing, right? To one, address those needs, the levels of income that are not going to necessarily be addressed through the other policies and initiatives, but also to address the more immediate, this isn't going to be immediate, right? When you do preservation, it can be more immediate. It's going to take a couple of years, but it's still going to be quicker than the time it takes for upzonings and other land use reforms to filter down prices to renters. We need to invest in affordable housing right now that is affordable to all of the income levels in your community. And I'll note that we'll talk about this later, but really matching up your policies and programs to make sure that they are linked with the incomes and needs of communities of color is huge for racial equity needs, and ensuring that the unit sizes and shapes that are being required through, say, inclusionary zoning are the sizes of the families that have needs. So, you see a lot of IZ programs where most of the units that come out are studios or one bedrooms. Well, you've got a lot of families in need that those aren't going to address the needs of them. So using things like housing trust funds and LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, to directly build affordable housing through nonprofit housing, affordable housing developers or other such entities should be paired with all of these. And community land trusts, don't have a lot of time to get into that, but that's another great way. You can use CLTs for both rental and home ownership and help people move from rental into affordable home ownership. Now we'll stop there.
All right, and if all of our guests could turn their videos back on, we'll move into the panel. I have some questions to lead us off with, but for all of you, the Q&A feature is available, and we'll do our best to turn to and incorporate those questions throughout the next 20-25 minutes of our discussion. I'd love to start first with, I'll go to Mike on this. You had that survey that looked at sort of different perspectives on what was needed and what works. And this is something that I've seen a lot, I'm sure all of us have, where people focus on different issues and it feels pretty polarized and that there's some level of misunderstanding. What is something that you would say, not to then revert into binary, but both cities, advocates, put the development, home ownership or property ownership community in there, are misunderstanding or not quite hearing that another group wants them to understand?
I think one of the biggest thing is one of the things that Shane mentioned with the issue of stability and predictability versus affordability. And there's that constant talking past each other. And it's circular because both sides have evidence on their side that rent control does support greater predictability. And so people that are arguing that that's their main value, that they have evidence to support their position. And then the conversation about affordability and means testing, those that may be opposed to rent control can say the same thing, that evidence is on our side. And so there's that. I don't know if that's as much of an intentional misunderstanding or if it's an unintentional misunderstanding. It probably depends on the specific conversation. But one other thing that I think that neither sides understand, or if they understand, they don't always empathize with, is the magnitude of the impact of bad actors. So we've heard this in our, less so in the survey, but more so in our interviews, that, we talked with tenant advocates that would have horror stories about how the conditions that certain tenants had to live in, or the ways and the lengths to which some bad actor landlords would go to evict in a case where it was inappropriate, or the unit condition, really horrible unit condition issues. And we see the impact on the magnitude of impact that can have on an individual tenant's lives. And over the course, and from the, if you look at it at a city level, if you have a tenant advocacy group or a tenant organizing group that's working with tenants throughout a whole city, you're getting a lot, any industry has good actors, bad actors, and those that are just getting in between, but there's enough bad actors over the size of a big city that's going to be first and foremost in their mind. On the flip side, we also heard of the impact that a problematic tenant can have on the ability to steward a property. Property damage in many cases. People talking about thousands of dollars when they had to turn out a unit. Tenants, this was particularly during the COVID crisis, when eviction moratoria in place, where tenants were threatening other tenants in the building. So the inability to remove one tenant from the building was creating instability in the other tenants in the household, in the property. And then the impact, if you have a smaller property, if you have non-payment of rent just for a short period of time, if you're a small property owner or manager, that can wipe out your property, your profit margin, and eat into your ability to maintain the property. You miss 3, 4, 5 months rent over the course of a turnover. That can have major implications. So I think, sorry for being long-winded on this, but I think that we need to really reckon with the implication that on both sides there are really just bad actors, and we need to address policy that can get to that, but also recognize that we need to balance that with the need to have policy that works on the median as well. So hopefully that's clear.
I could just add really quickly. I think in many cases, I frame this often as like sort of YIMBY types, pro-housing types versus like tenant advocate types. One group, let's say the YIMBYs, is often asking this question with new projects, with new policies. Who benefits from this? How can we make the city more affordable? How can we provide new resources and amenities? How can we better connect things? And tenant advocates and others working in that area are asking the question of who is harmed by this or that proposal, by this policy, and so forth. And very much generalizing here, but I think we kind of do fall into one or the other on what we focus on. And so when something is proposed, we'll, emphasize one or the other, and we can end up talking past each other for that reason as well.
So, one, I appreciate both of those comments. I actually want to start with the bad actors question and enforcement and tools there, because I think we have explored a lot in this region. It's not to say we haven't looked at tools there, but we've done a lot on increasing supply. There's some questions in the Q&A about this enforcement. Where have you guys seen effective tools or strategies for identifying bad actors and addressing those challenges quickly?
So I think that there's no one policy framework that can help address that. There needs to be a couple different components in place. And one, there has to be some ability. You need tenant protections in terms of eviction protections and some degree of power balancing in order to enforce housing quality issues, because there are, the consequence of losing your home in some of the cases, particularly for vulnerable tenants, is maybe homelessness. So you need to create sort of an environment in which tenants are willing to report issues and clarity about what their remedies are if those issues are not addressed. So you have to at first get to sort of the power dynamic, and some of the policies that address that are right to counsel, which is a bigger issue that we can touch on later. I suspect we might get to that, but right to counsel, tenant education efforts, as I mentioned earlier, some of those supports for tenant organizing. Another element, and this is not necessarily just with bad actors, but just technical assistance. A lot of places where where there may be housing quality challenges may not be necessarily from bad actors, but people that are maybe not overly sophisticated in the property management sector. So Montgomery County in the DC metro area in Maryland has an apartment assistance program, which is a education focused effort meant to assist small property owners predominantly, and it can help them tie them to specific tools, financing, loan programs, even potentially grant programs that often carry with them an affordability component. So it's a way to bring people into the regulated market. So that's one example. But I think just beefing up code enforcement offices is really important. Another policy effort that was tried in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but unfortunately it just got vetoed. The Commonwealth legislature passed on a bipartisan basis policy that would allow local municipalities to pursue property owners for lease violations or other housing quality issues on behalf of the tenant. So the tenant wouldn't necessarily have to be the one securing counsel or going to court, that the municipality could do it. And I think that could work. That type of structure can work, and we've heard of that in some circumstances, but unfortunately we don't have that now because that was just vetoed. The legislation was vetoed, but that's another concept that could work.
Yeah, and just echoing some of what you just said, Mike, I really emphasize, one, I've seen some great work around, especially during the COVID crisis and economic crisis that ensued, really working with community organizers to train and empower tenants to understand their own rights and fight for them themselves. They're in a lot of cities and a lot of localities. I've spoken with lawyers where there are just not enough lawyers to take on all these cases. And so one way of helping to address that in a larger scale is by helping organizers train tenants, really working with them to understand how to write legal letters, how to understand, not to the full extent that a lawyer would, but really understanding their rights and fighting them for them. But at the same time, like Mike said, many tenants are going to be hesitant to bring up concerns in their units for fear of eviction. particularly tenants who are undocumented or tenants of color. And so we also really need to have those regulations in place that protect them. But on the code enforcement side, having proactive code enforcement that does not rely on tenants to report things. So having required inspections regularly, or at least upon a rental of a property, having systems in place to be able to catch illegal renters, illegal rental units. There are many, really great data ways that you can identify which housing units in your city are illegally renting them and are not licensed. So using all of those to really make code enforcement proactive, and that is going to be also mean fully funding code enforcement, because in most cities it is not funded to the level that it should. But I think those are two things that can really help address that.
Gia, you used the phrase at one point in your presentation, necessary but not sufficient. And I will say that that is, for me, something that feels universal in housing affordability discussions. I appreciate the nuance called out earlier about the difference between predictable and stable versus affordability. But on affordability and these questions of supply and demand, it often feels like everything is attempting to stop the problem from getting worse, but not actually solving the problem. And I wonder if there is anything that you would point to that feels more like a solution. I know we talked about direct investment. Where does that come from? Are there other strategies that aren't just stop the hemorrhaging, but really tackle the problem?
That was to be?
What, if you could start, that'd be great.
Sure,
and then any of you can
absolutely.
jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's all of those exclusionary zoning laws that we have in place. That's going to be like the actual solution to the problem, rather than some of these things which are more band-aids, but are necessary, because those upzonings, those land use, I mean, some of them aren't gonna, we know don't have the potential for these negative amenity effects in the short run, like accessory dwelling units. They're also a drop in the bucket, right? But being able to make all of those comprehensive land use changes to make up for and address our decades, if not centuries of racist policy and planning that have led to our segregated neighborhoods that we see, and just the racial inequities in homeownership and wealth that are directly caused by the policies that we wrote in our history. So addressing those, removing those, and it's easier said than done, right? Because of what has already been mentioned with NIMBYs, and just really, I know it can be very hard to get these kinds of things passed. And I would encourage everyone to read a book called Neighborhood Defenders. It's all about how, and I believe this too, that the way in which we do community engagement around land use actually in many cases reinforces the voices of wealthy homeowners, because they're the ones who are most likely, no matter how much you try to have meetings that are in communities with low incomes or at times available, I mean, this is again going to be partially my opinion, there's so much stronger of an incentive for higher income homeowners to attend and participate in those discussions. And so that's going to make it hard. So I think we need to rethink the way we do community engagement around land use. And we need to also use data and evidence about equity impacts, potential equity impacts of policy changes, in addition to just community voice, because community voice, it often ends up not underrepresenting communities of color and communities with low income. So I think figuring out ways to address those barriers to removing these exclusionary zoning restrictions that have led to our unequal society, really, in many ways, is going to be the bigger thing that we need to change. But these other policies and programs need to be, like Shane said, we need those pain pills in the short term to ensure not only that we're benefiting people now and people at different income levels, but that we're addressing the fact that there are actually some potential negative impacts in the short run from such upzonings and reforms.
So I'll just, one other thing is, like, we talk about supply growth, but it's really important to, and I do think, getting to closer in growing areas, we need considerable supply growth, but we can't just look at the aggregate number of units, although that is important. We can't ignore aggregate number of units. We have to look at the dimensions of supply, what's being built, where, and by whom. I think these different dimensions of supply dramatically impact affordability and stability writ large. So is this most of our supply going to be in, major redeveloping corridors, large scale, big projects? That's going to have a different set of implications for supply than if it's more broad-based and smaller scale projects. And that's not sort of, we need kind of all of the above, but you can think about that from policy. Is your path of least resistance going to incentivize redevelopment of a certain type of property that maybe is currently serving low income or vulnerable tenants? Like that, having those kinds of nuanced conversations about how we grow is really important. And this gets to one of the comments, one of the questions I saw in the Q&A is about how do we, even as we're adding supply, how do we make sure that housing is affordable moving forward? Because there is a power dynamic that allows property owners to raise rents in many cases. And one is the committed affordable housing. Supply of income restricted, subsidized affordable housing is absolutely critical. But the other is just making sure that you have diversity of property owners and managers and developers as well. So, big corporate investment can have good and bad implications, and that's a conversation for another day. But if those are the only players in the market, they have return expectations that might be different than smaller developers, more mom and pops that may have less of a buffer to hold out for larger rent increases or encouraging turnover. The cost of turnover for them may have a more negative impact than it would be for some of the larger properties. That's not to say that there aren't problematic actors in the smaller scale developer or smaller scale landlord side. Like I said, every single segment of the sector has its good, bad, and medium level actors. But if you are sort of doubling down on only one type of supply growth and not addressing the full dimensions of supply, then you're going to have some of the same market distortions that we have now, but just in a slightly less supply constrained environment.
So I want to go in a slightly different direction. Shane, your approach has been sort of framed as taking in all of the above. How do you think about the range of solutions that are offered and layering them? Can you talk about how to do that strategically? I think what I'm specifically getting at is sometimes we layer in a range of, it's just a small cost on new construction here and a small cost here, and then suddenly it's $20,000 per unit of additional costs that are layered in, or city costs that in a void or what political power at the moment can seem small, and that add in different ways, some that are good and powerful and some that could have negative interaction. So could you just talk about how you would link an all of the above approach together strategically?
Yeah, just to preface this a little bit, I think, if someone comes forward with an upzoning proposal and it's just an upzoning proposal, there will be community-based organizations, tenant advocates who say, there's no displacement protections, there's no rent stabilization for nearby households. And so we're going to oppose this. And similarly, if someone comes forward with a rent stabilization proposal or some kind of restriction on, tearing down smaller multifamily, quote unquote, naturally occurring affordable housing, but it's not tied to any upzoning or anything like that, the YIMBYs and others are going to say, well, this is just going to restrict supply, and I'm going to oppose it for that reason. And so I like this probably apocryphal line from is it Eisenhower, one of the presidents, who said, if you can't solve a problem, enlarge it. And Alan Durning at Sightline Institute wrote about this a while back as well. And it's basically this idea that, like, if you can't make progress by just focusing on the one thing that maybe you personally are interested in or know the most about, you need to enlarge the problem, address the kind of unintended or known or potentially unknown consequences of it, and kind of package them together. And so that upzoning proposal also includes displacement protections to ensure that certain properties are not going to be targeted for redevelopment, just for example. I think this is not exactly that, but this is, I think, an important kind of strategic approach is what Seattle did in 2015 or so with its housing affordability and livability agenda, which is they put together a panel or a group of something like 27 different people representing tenant advocates, developers, landlords, architects, faith groups, environmentalists, etc., just as wide a group as you could come up with. And they worked for like 9 months on a plan trying to get, and the only things that made it into the plan were the things that got something like 70 or 80% buy-in, approval by that percentage of the members of the group. And at the end of the day, they had something like 65 recommendations. It just ran the gamut from things to increase supply, things to increase funding, tenant protections, process reforms, just everything. And 5 years later, they had fully implemented something like half or a third of these recommendations. Something like 80% had at least made some progress. That's really good for 5 years, especially on pretty difficult issues. And I think, in some respects it shows in Seattle, they've built more housing than just about everywhere. They have more pressure on in terms of demand than just about anywhere as well. So they still haven't been able to do enough, but they've made a lot of progress. And the last thing I'll say about it is that there was a coalition that formed around that 27-person group called Seattle for Everyone. And I think part of putting those people all in the same room and allowing that coalition to form is why that was the group that continued to push for implementation after the report was developed. And so it was all tied together. And I think that is a model that, with some tweaks, depending on the area, could work elsewhere as well.
We are hitting the end of our time. I want to ask you guys to try and give a 1 or 2 sentence answer, which I know is always hard, to one final question, which is, in the midst of what you know about this region, thinking about this conversation, what is one thing that you would tell our city leaders, staff, electeds to go and look at, next week? Like, check if you're doing this or start to do this. Anyone want to jump in first?
I can go first because I'm going to give probably maybe a little bit different of an answer than what you're asking. I'm sorry, I've already said one sentence. I would say listen to and build trust with community and listen to them about their needs before you do anything else. You need to do that long-term trust building and with community. I mean, communities with low income and communities of color, communities with people with disabilities, people who have been historically excluded from these types of decisions. Go out and ensure that you are fully funding a full-time community outreach employee, at least one. We heard that so many had been let go during COVID or beforehand. Do that long-term trust building with communities, listening, understanding, so that you can develop policies that address their needs and can track it in the long term as well.
All right, Mike, 2 sentences.
Support and provide resources for the preservation of existing affordable housing, whether market rate or otherwise. I think that's key. The second is right size whatever your policies are to your capacity and focus on good governance. I think those are the 2 big things.
Shane?
I'm going to steal from what Mike said earlier, which is I think folks should really emphasize the sort of missing middle housing typology of the duplexes to 10, 12 unit buildings. Just the affordability, the achievability, and also encouraging more kind of small local developers and that kind of thing. All of that can really help a lot.
Thank you so much to you all. I'm going to turn it over to Libby Starling from the Federal Reserve to close us out.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you to our 3 presenters, Shane Phillips, Michael Spots, Tina Stacy, for your insights today. The video from today's event will be available on the Minneapolis Fed website in a few days once we get all of the T's crossed and I's dotted on that. And we encourage you to tell your friends about the video. We will be posting the presentations as well, and also to look at the videos of our previous 3 events in the series. My thanks as well to Stephanie and the Urban Land Institute for co-sponsoring the series with the Minneapolis Fed. And we thank you for your time today.